before there was a streak, before there were pythons and bandanas, before Madison Square Garden was the cathedral of professional wrestling, the building had actually given up on the sport entirely. Wrestling had not run regularly at the Garden since 1938. The business was considered a dying carnival act, unworthy of the world's most famous arena. Then, a barefoot acrobat from Argentina walked through the doors, and everything changed. His name was Antonino Rocca, and the numbers he produced are the reason an entire industry exists today. In his Garden debut in 1949, he drew 17,854 fans for a gate of $50,639, the largest wrestling gate in the United States at that moment. He went on an unbroken run of 7 straight years in which he headlined or co-headlined virtually every main event the Garden hosted. He once drew 21,950 people to a single match, setting a post-war attendance record for the building. Promoters had to turn thousands of paying customers away at the door. His fans were so passionate that one night in 1957 they tore the place apart in a full-scale riot. And here is the detail that should stop you cold. Antonino Rocca never once held a world championship. It did not matter. In that arena, his match was always the main event, even when the recognized world champion was wrestling on the very same card. The champion was a footnote. Rocca was the man the people came to see, the only name that truly mattered on the marquee. Across the entire country in that era, only one wrestler was a bigger star, and on the East Coast, Rocca was the uncontested king. The company he built his name in would grow up to become World Wrestling Entertainment. So how did a barefoot acrobat from Argentina become the man who filled Madison Square Garden every single week? He was not born in Argentina, and he was not born Antonino Rocca. He came into the world as Antonino Biasetin on April 13, 1921, in Treviso, a small city in northern Italy near Venice. His family was poor, and like millions of Europeans in those years, they went looking for a better life across the ocean. They found it in Argentina, settling in the working-class city of Rosario, and it was there that the Italian boy grew into a South American athlete. And what an athlete! Young Antonino threw himself into sports, excelling at rugby and soccer, eventually playing rugby at the University of Rosario. This is the foundation that made everything else possible, because rugby and soccer build a very particular kind of body. Explosive, agile, balanced, comfortable in the air, and on the move, in a way that the slow, ground-bound strongmen of wrestling simply were not. He was roughly 6 feet tall and 225 pounds, but he did not move like a heavyweight. He moved like a gymnast, who happened to be enormous. That combination, real size married to real acrobatic agility, was almost unheard of in the wrestling world he was about to enter. The mat game of the 1940s was a grinding, methodical affair of holds and counter-holds, 2 big men leaning on each other for an hour. It was wrestling as a test of toughness. Nobody flew. Nobody leaped. Nobody used the air. Rocca's body was built to do exactly that, and somewhere in Argentina, the right teacher recognized it. He fell under the wing of Stanislaus Zbyszko, a legendary former world heavyweight champion, one of the genuine hard men of the old school, who had retired to South America. It is one of the quiet symmetries of wrestling history. The same Zbyszko family would, years later and a hemisphere away, train a young Harley race on a Missouri farm. Zbyszko taught the Italian-Argentine athlete the craft of professional wrestling. But what Rocca did with that craft, no teacher could have shown him, because nobody had ever done it before. He turned professional in Buenos Aires in the mid-1940s, and almost immediately he began doing things in a wrestling ring that audiences had simply never seen. He took the explosive athleticism of the rugby pitch and translated it into the squared circle, inventing, or very nearly inventing, an entire style of wrestling that did not yet have a name: high-flying, aerial maneuvers. He threw drop kicks, launching both feet into an opponent's chest. He spun men into flying head scissors and victory rolls. He moved off the ground, into the air, with a grace that made the grim mat wrestlers of the era look like they were standing still. And he did it all barefoot. This became his signature, his trademark, the thing that made him instantly recognizable. The storyline reason was that he had grown up too poor to afford boots, a tale that landed perfectly with the working-class crowds who would come to adore him. The real reason was simpler and more brilliant. His bare feet, all of size 13, gave him the grip and the dexterity of a second pair of hands. He could throw an opponent with his feet. He could climb and balance and flip in a way that boots would never have allowed. The bare feet were not a gimmick. They were a tool and a symbol all at once. It is hard, from where we stand now, to grasp how radical this was. Today, every wrestling broadcast on Earth is full of men flying off the top rope, swinging through the air, turning the ring into an aerial circus. That entire vocabulary, the dropkick, the flying head scissors, the leap from the ropes, had to be invented by someone, and a strong case says that someone was Antonino Rocca. He was not refining an existing style. He was creating one from scratch, in front of audience who had never imagined a heavyweight could move like a trapeze artist. Other wrestlers watched him and were baffled. Then they watched him fill arenas, and then they started trying to copy him, badly. He was the original. Everyone else was a tracing. He brought this strange new act to the United States in 1948, debuting in Galveston, Texas, where he stunned local audiences and was quickly billed as a regional champion. Word spread fast about the Flying Argentine, and in 1949, the man who would change his life came calling, a shrewd, powerful wrestling promoter named Toots Mondt, who owned the exclusive contract to a giant of an athlete and keys to the most important market in the country. Mondt brought Rocca to New York. On December 12, 1949, Antonino Rocca wrestled at Madison Square Garden for the first time against a muscular star named Gene Stanley. He drew 17,854 people and the biggest wrestling gate in America. The arena that had written off wrestling more than a decade earlier suddenly had a reason to open its doors again, and the barefoot acrobat had found the stage he was born for. Rocca arrived in New York at the exact moment that a brand new invention was about to turn him into a national phenomenon: the television set. In the early 1950s, wrestling became one of the very first things broadcast into American living rooms, and it is impossible to overstate how perfect Rocca was for the new medium. The grinding, hold-for-hold style of traditional wrestling looked dull on a small black-and-white screen, but Rocca flew. His dropkicks and flips and barefoot acrobatics translated through the camera with a clarity and excitement nothing else in the sport could match. As more and more families bought television sets, more and more eyes fell on the Flying Argentine, and his demand exploded into orbit. The wrestlers on those early broadcasts became national celebrities, and none shone brighter than Rocca. A promoter named Vincent J. McMahon Sr. understood exactly what he had. When McMahon built his Capital Wrestling operation and put a weekly program on the air, Rocca was the lead attraction, the headliner, the face of the whole enterprise. He cartwheeled his way into becoming a genuine household name. In an age before cable, before the internet, before 100 channels competed for attention, a handful of wrestlers beamed into millions of homes each week, became some of the most recognized faces in the country. And Rocca was at the very front of that pack. Children imitated his dropkicks in backyards. Newspapers covered his matches. He was not merely popular. He was a star in the fullest modern sense, one of the first athletes the new medium of television manufactured into a celebrity. And in the great immigrant neighborhoods of New York, the Italians and the Puerto Ricans, who packed into tenements and worked grinding jobs for low pay, Rocca became something far more powerful than a television star. He became their hero. The barefoot working-class kid who flew through the air and battled the villains was one of them, and every night he wrestled. He gave them a few hours of joy and pride and escape. When he climbed into that ring, he was not just fighting an opponent. He was carrying the dignity of every immigrant who had ever been looked down on and beating the bigger, richer, meaner men who stood across from him. For people with little, he was proof that one of their own could conquer the most famous arena in the world. But here is the wall, and it reveals an old divide in wrestling that has never fully closed. The purists hated him. To the establishment, to the serious mat wrestlers, and the men who controlled the National Wrestling Alliance, Rocca was not a real wrestler at all. He was a circus act, a showman, a flashy acrobat who could not, in their eyes, actually wrestle. The recognized world champion of the era, the great Lou Thesz, was a legitimate tough man, a shooter who represented everything Rocca was not. And when the two styles met at the box office, the results were sometimes mixed. A pair of Thesz vs. Rocca matches in 1953 drew disappointing crowds, the methodical champion and the high-flying showman never quite clicking. The message from the gatekeepers was clear. Spectacle was not the same as greatness. The acrobat would never be given their crown. They were about to be proven spectacularly, overwhelmingly wrong about what wrestling actually was. Because while the establishment argued about what counted as real wrestling, Antonino Rocca quietly became the most valuable attraction the business had. He did not need their world title. He had something they could not give him and could not take away. He had the people. His connection to New York's immigrant communities deepened into something close to devotion. To the Italian and Spanish-speaking fans of the city, Rocca was not a performer they watched. He was a champion they owned, a people's champion decades before that phrase became famous. A hero who looked like them and came from where they came from and fought every single night against bigger, meaner, richer-looking villains and won with style and joy. He gave hard-working people a release, a reason to spend their few spare dollars, a figure to roar for. That bond was worth more than any belt the NWA could have handed him. And then he made it even stronger by finding the perfect partner. In the mid-1950s, Rocca teamed with a young Puerto Rican wrestler named Miguel Perez, and the pairing was box office lightning. An Italian-Argentine and a Puerto Rican, fighting side by side, embodied the two largest immigrant communities in New York at once. The fans did not just cheer them, they adopted them. In 1957, Rocca and Perez captured the Tag Team Championship of McMahon's promotion, and in doing so, they became the first recognized tag team champions in the entire lineage of the company that would one day be called World Wrestling Entertainment. The very first link in that chain was the barefoot acrobat and his partner. Before there was a single world champion in that company's history, there were Rocca and Perez holding the gold and holding the city in the palm of their hands. Week after week, month after month, they filled Madison Square Garden. Not occasionally, not for special events every week. The building that had abandoned wrestling now could not run it often enough because a barefoot man and his friend kept selling every seat in the house. The establishment could sneer all it wanted. Antonino Rocca was building the foundation of an empire, one sold-out garden at a time. To understand the height of Rocca's reign over New York, you have to abandon the modern idea of what a wrestling star is, because he was something the business has rarely seen since. A man who owned a building. For 7 straight uninterrupted years, Antonino Rocca headlined or co-headlined essentially every major show at Madison Square Garden. 7 years. Think about what that means. Through the entire heart of the 1950s, the most famous arena in the world ran wrestling on the strength of one man, and that man never slipped, never cooled off, never lost his grip on the crowd. On March 30th, 1957, a Rocca-headlined card drew more than 20,000 paying fans. McMahon Sr. routinely had to turn thousands of people away at the doors, fans who had traveled to the Garden and could not get in because the barefoot acrobat had already sold every seat. And in January of 1960, in a match against a young copycat who had stolen his style, billed as the amazing Zoomer, Rocca drew 21,950 people, a post-war record for wrestling at the Garden. But the single greatest proof of what Rocca meant to his fans was not a sellout. It was a riot. On the night of November 19th, 1957, Rocca teamed with the French-Canadian high-flyer Edouard Carpentier against two of the most hated villains in the territory, the brutal Dick the Bruiser and the sneering bleached blonde Dr. Jerry Graham. The nearly 13,000 fans in the building were white-hot from the opening bell. And as the match descended into chaos, as the villains bled and the crowd's fury boiled over, the unthinkable happened. The fans erupted. Picture it. Hundreds of spectators pour out of their seats and storm toward the ring, a wave of bodies surging over the barriers. Police officers wade in and are injured, trying to hold back the tide. An estimated 500 fans riot inside Madison Square Garden, all of it ignited by the passion Rocca and his rivals had whipped into a frenzy. It was so serious that it made headlines and brought scrutiny down on the whole sport, prompting hard questions in the press about whether wrestling crowds had become too dangerous to control. That is the kind of devotion this man commanded. His fans did not politely applaud. They were ready to tear the building down for him, and it was not an isolated night. This was the temperature Rocca ran at, year-round, for years on end. He drew villains the audience could truly despise, men like the brutal Dick the Bruiser and the loathsome Dr. Jerry Graham, and then he sent the crowd home delirious every time the barefoot hero turned the tables. The Garden was not a building he visited. It was a building he ruled, week after week, in a reign so long and so total that the modern business has almost no comparison for it. He was not a champion who defended a belt a few times a year. He was the constant, the fixed star, the one name the box office could be built on 365 days a year. And underneath the spectacle, something historic was being constructed. Every one of those sold-out nights was money and momentum flowing into Vincent J. McMahon Sr.'s Capital Wrestling Corporation. Rocca was, more than any other single performer, the draw that made that company viable, the engine that powered it through the 1950s. Capital Wrestling would later be renamed the Worldwide Wrestling Federation, and then the World Wrestling Federation, and finally, World Wrestling Entertainment, the largest wrestling company in the history of the planet. And at the very bottom of that towering structure, holding it all up, was a barefoot Italian-Argentine acrobat, selling out the Garden week after week after week. He was also, without fully realizing it, inventing two of the most important ideas in modern wrestling. He was the first true high flyer, the man who proved that aerial spectacle could draw bigger crowds than any methodical mat grappler. Every wrestler who has ever climbed to the top rope and launched into the air owes a debt to the barefoot man who did it first, decades before it had a name. And he was the first ethnic pride people's champion, the hero who drew his power not from a title belt, but from a community that saw itself in him. Both of those ideas would outlive him by generations. Both of them are running through professional wrestling to this very day. Slow down here, because the man behind the acrobat was gentler and more complicated than the roaring crowds ever knew, and his story does not end in triumph. Away from the violence of the ring, Antonino Rocca was a cultured, soft-spoken man with a deep love of opera. He was said to have a beautiful, if completely untrained, singing voice. And in one of the most charming friendships in the history of the sport, the great conductor Arturo Toscanini, one of the most celebrated musicians of the 20th century and a secret wrestling fan, became a genuine friend of Rocca's. Imagine it, the maestro of the symphony and the barefoot acrobat of the Garden, two Italian immigrants who had each conquered New York in their own wildly different ways, talking about music, There was far more to this man than drop kicks. But the wrestling business is not sentimental, and time comes for every draw. As the 1950s turned into the 1960s, McMahon Sr. began looking to the future, and he made a fateful decision. He brought in a powerful young strongman from Pittsburgh named Bruno Sammartino, and he positioned him alongside Rocca, first as a tag team partner, essentially as a second banana riding in the older star's shadow. But the plan was bigger than a tag team. McMahon saw in Bruno the next great ethnic hero, the next man to capture the Italian and immigrant crowds that Rocca had built. And so the torch began to pass, whether Rocca wanted it to or not. The aging acrobat, now in his 40s, was slowly eased down the pecking order as the younger, fresher Sammartino was elevated to take his place. There is a quiet cruelty in it that anyone who has grown older in their work will recognize. Rocca had done nothing wrong. He had simply aged, as everyone does, and the body that had flown through the air for 2 decades could no longer do it quite the way it once had. The crowds still loved him, but the business was already looking past him to the next man. By the early 1960s, the message was unmistakable. This was Bruno's company now. Bruno would become the champion. Bruno would inherit the roaring immigrant fans, and alongside Pedro Morales would carry them into the next 2 decades. And Antonino Rocca, the man who had built the entire house, the man who had brought wrestling back to the Garden and packed it for 7 straight years, would not play second fiddle in the empire he had founded. So he left. He walked away from the company he had made because his pride would not let him stand in the shadow of his own replacement. After he left, the fall was long and quiet and hard to watch. Rocca tried to make it on his own, branching out and booking his own shows, running a competing promotion in Queens, even promoting matches connected to the 1964 World's Fair. He kept wrestling, traveling coast to coast, the aging acrobat still climbing into rings across the country. But the great days were behind him, and a series of bad investments drained what he had earned in all those sold-out gardens. The man who had once turned thousands away from the most famous arena in the world ended up taking ordinary jobs to get by, working as a security guard in New Jersey and as a physical therapist in Florida. The King of New York, anonymous, punching a clock. There was one last grace note. In 1975, Vincent J. McMahon Sr. brought him back into the fold, not as a wrestler now, but as a Spanish-language commentator, putting his beloved voice and his deep connection to the Hispanic audience to work calling the action for the company he had helped build. For a brief moment, Rocca was home again, part of the family, his greatness quietly acknowledged. It did not last long. While working in Puerto Rico, Rocca fell ill, and he returned to New York. On March 15, 1977, at Roosevelt Hospital, Antonino Rocca died from complications of a urinary infection. For years it was reported that he was 49 years old, because he had shaved years off his age long ago, the way wrestlers did. Only later did a historian, digging through old records, uncover his real birth year, and reveal that he was in fact 55. He was survived by his wife and their 3 children. In 1995, nearly 2 decades after his death, the company he had helped found inducted him into its Hall of Fame, an overdue acknowledgement that without this barefoot acrobat, there might never have been a glut of wrestling fans at all. Strip away the bare feet and the drop kicks and the roaring crowds, and look at what actually happened here. A poor Italian boy crossed an ocean to Argentina, grew into a rugby-playing athlete, and then crossed another ocean to New York, carrying something no one in American wrestling had ever seen: a body that could fly and the imagination to use it. He arrived at a Madison Square Garden that had given up on his sport, and he single-handedly gave it a reason to believe again. He proved, against an entire establishment that sneered at him, that spectacle and athleticism and joy could fill a building faster than any grim test of toughness. He invented the high-flying style that the whole modern sport is now built on. and he became the first true people's champion, a hero who drew his power not from a belt but from the love of working people, who saw their own struggles and their own pride reflected in a barefoot man fighting giants. He never got the world title. He never got to grow old as the king. He built the house and was out of it, watched a younger man inherit his crowd, and faded into bad investments and ordinary jobs before dying too soon. But the things he created did not fade. Bruno Sammartino became a legend by walking the path Rocca cleared. Pedro Morales did the same. Every immigrant hero, every flying acrobat, every wrestler who ever drew strength from a community that loved them is standing on the foundation that a barefoot man poured in the 1950s. So where does he actually rank? And you have to be honest, because the honest case for Antonino Rocca is unusual and it has real holes. If the question is who was the greatest pure wrestler, Rocca is not the answer, and the men of his own era would have told you so loudly. He never held a world championship, not once. The establishment genuinely viewed him as a circus act rather than a serious grappler, and by the technical standards of legitimate, hard men like Lou Thesz, that criticism was not entirely unfair. Rocca was a showman and an athlete far more than he was a mat technician. His matches, by modern standards, were simple, and even at the box office he was not flawless. Some of his cards underperformed, and some of his biggest matches against more traditional wrestlers left fans cold. He was not invincible, and he was not a champion. But change the question, and the entire argument tilts. Ask who was one of the most important and influential draws in the history of the business, and Rocca's case becomes overwhelming. In his entire era, only Gorgeous George, the original glamour boy showman, was a bigger star anywhere in America, and on the East Coast not even George could touch him. He brought wrestling back to Madison Square Garden after more than a decade of exile, and then sold it out for 7 straight years. He was the financial engine of the company that became the global giant WWE. He invented, or as good as invented, the high-flying style that defines wrestling today. And he created the template of the ethnic people's champion that every beloved immigrant hero since has followed. Few wrestlers who never won a title have ever mattered this much. So how good was he, actually? As a pure wrestler, debatable and never a champion, but as a draw, as an innovator, as a cultural force, and as a founding pillar of the entire modern industry, he stands among the most important figures the business has ever produced. The honest verdict fits a man who flew when everyone else stayed on the ground. Antonino Rocca was not the greatest wrestler of his age, and he never wore the crown, but he may have been the most beloved, and he was, without question, one of the most important. He proved that wrestling could fly, and that a hero needs no belt if the people are with him. Everything that came after was built on those 2 ideas and on his bare feet. A barefoot boy from Treviso flew across 2 oceans and into the air above Madison Square Garden, gave a forgotten sport its cathedral back, and built the foundation of an empire he would never get to rule. But the one man in all of America who was a bigger star than Rocca in those golden television years was not an acrobat at all. He was a preening, perfumed, golden-haired showman who sprayed the ring with perfume and made an entire nation tune in just to watch somebody, anybody, wipe the smirk off his face. Next time, we tell the story of Gorgeous George, the original glamour boy, the man who taught wrestling that the show was always the point, and the peacock whose perfume and arrogance drew a nation to its television sets.